The dinner rush at La Serenera had reached its quiet, elegant rhythm, a place where the wealthy murmured over polished wine glasses and the criminally powerful made deals under the glow of warm amber lights. Conversations blended into a soft hum. Silverware clinked gently against porcelain. And for a moment, the world inside the restaurant seemed perfectly balanced. As if nothing dangerous could survive in such refined air. But that illusion shattered the moment the front doors swung open with a force that didn't belong to a child, yet came from one. Evan Reyes was only 7 years old. Small for his age, his jacket frayed at the sleeves, his sneakers soaked from walking through half the city on foot. His breaths came in short, uneven bursts, fear, cold, and determination twisting together in his tiny chest. He stood in the entryway just long enough for every pair of eyes to land on him. Then he marched forward. No hesitation. No second thoughts. Only purpose. The elegant room fell into an unnatural stillness. The kind that doesn't belong anywhere except a battlefield. Forks stopped midair. A waiter froze with a tray halfway lowered. Even the pianist's fingers faltered above the keys, before instinct saved the melody. But Evan didn't hear any of that. His eyes were locked on one man, Adrian Moretti, the most feared name in the city, a man with power woven through every corner of the criminal underworld. People didn't approach Adrian, they waited to be acknowledged. Yet, this child walked straight to him. Adrian sat at his usual table near the rear of the dining room. A place chosen not for privacy, but for dominance. Everyone entered through his line of sight. His associates leaned in as he spoke, their attention fixed on every controlled, measured word, until Evan reached the table, raised his trembling hand, and grabbed the sleeve of Adrian's silk shirt. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Adrian's men moved instantly, hands drifting toward concealed weapons. Chair scraping back, tension slicing through the air like a drawn blade. But Adrian lifted one finger. Just one. And the entire room obeyed. The boy's hand shook violently. But he didn't release his grip. Adrian studied the small fingers clutching his sleeve before slowly letting his gaze travel upward to the face of a child who had no idea what kind of man he was touching. Or perhaps, Adrian realized with a growing curiosity. The child did know, and had still decided to come. Evan swallowed hard. His voice, small, but piercing in the silence. One of your guys made my mum cry all night. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse with the wildness of panic. His voice was steady in the way only desperation can be steady. In all of Adrian's years commanding men, empires, and fear itself, he had never heard a line quite like that. It pierced through the varnished calm of the restaurant and settled somewhere deep, somewhere he didn't allow many things to reach. His associates stared in disbelief. How had this child even found the place? And more importantly, how was Adrian still sitting? Still, Evan's fingers tightened around the fabric, knuckles whitening. The boy's eyes glistened with unshed tears, not from fear, but from the ache of carrying something far too heavy for a child's heart. Adrian didn't yank his sleeve away. He didn't scold. He didn't even blink at the audacity. He simply looked, and in that long, unnerving stare, Adrian noticed everything: the scraped hands, the torn jacket, the hunger tucked behind bravado, the exhaustion in his small shoulders, the courage in his stance that felt too old for his age. "What's your mother's name?" Adrian asked. His voice was low, steady, and quiet enough that the boy had to lean in slightly just to hear. "Lena Hart," Evan whispered, as though saying her name out loud might somehow make her safer. Something flickered across Adrian's expression, a movement so brief that anyone else might have missed it, but the boy didn't. He saw the moment the name landed. Adrian leaned back slightly, letting the dining room's lights cast faint shadows across his face. People who knew him would later swear that this was the moment everything changed, when the story veered off its expected path. But none of them understood why. Only Adrian did. He raised his hand again, signaling to his right-hand man. The associate stepped away immediately. Already dialing. Already moving to investigate. Whatever Adrian wanted, the city would provide within minutes. Meanwhile, the mafia boss returned his attention to the child who dared touch him. "How did you get here?" he asked. "I walked." Evan's voice cracked on the word, as if admitting the truth cost him something. "How far?" 17 blocks. Adrian exhaled slowly. A barely there movement. To a man like him. 17 blocks through dark streets equaled 17 lifetimes of danger for a child alone. "Sit," Adrian said, gesturing to the empty chair beside him. "You walked here. You're tired." The words weren't warm. They weren't gentle. But there was something else in them, something Evan didn't quite understand, yet instinctively trusted. Evan hesitated, lips quivering, torn between fear and exhaustion. Then he climbed onto the seat, perching nervously on its edge. As if sitting too comfortably might be a mistake, Adrian watched the boy's eyes dart around the room, assessing exits, scanning faces, calculating risks. Children weren't supposed to understand danger like this. "What did the men look like?" Adrian asked quietly. Evan answered instantly, with precision that made even Adrian's trained men exchange glances. Tall, 2 of them, one with a scar on his cheek. Black sedan, scratched rear bumper, license plate, starting with 9, F3. Adrian held still. Not a shadow of doubt crossed his face, but something colder did. This wasn't a frightened child guessing. This was a child who had seen everything. He leaned toward Evan, voice softer than anyone in the room had ever heard him use. "You're observant," he murmured. The boy's chin lifted, though his eyes shimmered with fear. "My mum cried," Evan whispered. "She never cries." Adrian's jaw tightened slightly. Only those closest to him would recognize the subtle shift as a ripple of anger, cold, controlled, and deadly. Minutes later, his associate returned. The man didn't speak loudly. He didn't need to. He whispered into Adrian's ear. And whatever he said made the restaurant's warmth suddenly feel colder. Adrian rose to his feet. He didn't do it with haste or violence. He simply stood, yet the movement sent a quiet wave of dread across the table. The boy looked up at him, searching his face with the desperate hope only children know how to display. Adrian met his eyes. "Your mother didn't miss work," he said evenly. "She was taken." Evan's breath hitched. His fists curled into small, useless weapons. Adrian placed a steady hand on the boy's shoulder, not possessive, not forceful, just enough to anchor him. "By one of my own." Adrian continued. "A man named Luca." The name left his lips like a sentence. Evan swallowed hard. "Is she? She's alive." The relief nearly knocked Evan's small body forward. Adrian bent slightly to look at him fully. "Come with me," he said. "We're getting your mother." Evan didn't hesitate. He stood up so quickly his chair nearly tipped over. As they walked through the restaurant together, this tiny boy, beside a man feared across the city, every person silently shifted out of their path. Not from Adrian, but from the force of something more powerful than fear, purpose. When they reached the entrance, the driver opened the black car's rear door. Evan climbed inside without being asked, his small hands gripping the edge of the leather seat. Adrian slid in beside him, leaving a careful space, though his presence filled the car more than any shadow. The door closed. The engine hummed. The city lights stretched across the windows like streaks of warning. Evan stared straight ahead. Adrian studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You shouldn't have come alone." Evan didn't look at him. "I had to." "And why is that?" The boy blinked, tears finally spilling, even though he tried to hide them. "Because no one else was going to save her." The car fell into silence, not cold, not uncomfortable, but charged with unspoken understanding. Adrian turned his gaze toward the dark road ahead, voice lowering to something nearly human. "You were wrong," he said. Evan looked up. "You're not alone." Adrian finished. The car accelerated into the night, carrying with it a mafia boss who had just chosen a side, and a brave little boy who refused to let the world forget his mother. The city always looked different at night, sharper, colder, stripped of every illusion daylight allowed. As Adrian's car turned off the main road and onto the cracked pavement leading to the abandoned factory, even the air seemed to shift, thickening with the tension of something long overdue. Evan pressed his forehead against the cold window, eyes wide and frightened, searching the shadows for any sign of his mother. He didn't speak. He didn't breathe. The silence inside the car felt like a held heartbeat. When the vehicle stopped, Adrian stepped out first, moving with a kind of quiet purpose that made even the darkness draw back. Most men announce their anger with noise. Adrian's anger was the opposite. It arrived in absolute stillness. That was how you knew it was lethal. He opened the rear door, letting Evan climb out. The boy stumbled a little, his legs shaking. But Adrian steadied him with a hand on his shoulder, a hand large enough to crush, yet used with a gentleness that didn't match his reputation. He didn't ask if Evan was ready. He simply said, "Stay close." The warehouse door groaned open with a long metallic screech, revealing a cavernous interior lit only by flickering emergency lights. The air smelled of rust, oil, and something else. Fear. Evan's small hand clung to Adrian's sleeve as they stepped inside. The first thing Evan heard was the dripping of water. Slow, uneven. The next thing he heard was breathing that didn't sound right, shallow, broken, almost trapped. And then he saw her. Lena Hart sat bound to a metal chair in the center of the room, her hair plastered to her face, her clothes soaked through as if she'd been drenched with ice water. Her head hung low, chin touching her chest, a bruise blossoming across her cheek. Her wrists were tied so tightly her skin had turned raw. For one terrible heartbeat, Evan feared the worst. Then he saw her chest rise. "Mom!" he screamed, his voice cracking under the weight of everything he had been holding inside. He ran toward her, tears streaming freely now, his small body shaking with relief and terror all at once. Adrian didn't run. He walked, every step deliberate, every step heavier than the last. 2 guards stood near Lena, their expressions shifting violently when they saw who had walked into the room. Their hands twitched toward weapons, but they froze under Adrian's stare. No yelling, no theatrics, just a cold, bone-deep calm, a calm that meant death. Adrian didn't look at the men at first. His eyes were fixed on Lena, on the bruises someone dared to put on her, on the trembling breaths she fought to take. On the way, her body sagged against the restraints. A muscle in his jaw tightened. Slow and precise. Then, finally, he spoke. "Cut her free." The words were soft enough to be mistaken for kindness. But even Evan, through his tears, heard the steel inside them. The guards moved quickly, far too quickly for men who thought themselves hardened. The knife that sliced the plastic ties snapped through the air with small, sharp clicks. Evan immediately threw his arms around his mother, pressing his face to her soaked chest. "Baby, baby." "I'm here," Lena whispered, her voice hoarse and trembling. She tried to lift her hand to touch him, but her arm barely responded. Adrian stood a few feet away, watching them, his expression unreadable, but his eyes told a different story. Something simmered beneath the surface. Something cold and controlled. Something promising that the men who did this would not leave this room unchanged. But none of that was for the child to see. He turned slightly toward his men. "Take her," Gently, two of them moved forward, their hands careful and respectful, as if handling something sacred. Evan held onto her until Adrian crouched beside him. "She needs care," he said quietly. "Let them help her." Evan wiped his face with the back of his sleeve, nodding even though it tore something inside him to let go. Adrian rose to his full height and followed the group out, his presence creating a path through the darkness. They brought Lena to a safe house on the outskirts of the city, one of Adrian's private properties, usually reserved for emergencies, more complicated than most people ever heard about. Inside, warm light spilled across polished floors. Clean blankets waited on the couch. The air smelled faintly of cedar and laundry soap. A doctor silent, discreet arrived within minutes. Evan refused to leave his mother's side, his small hand wrapped around hers, careful not to touch the bruises. Meanwhile, Adrian stood in the doorway, saying nothing, just watching. His expression wasn't soft, but it wasn't distant either. He looked like a man trying to understand something unfamiliar. It was Lena who finally broke the silence. Her voice was thin, worn, colored with disbelief and confusion. Why help us?" Adrian didn't answer right away. He looked at Evan first, the boy now curled against his mother. Finally safe. Finally allowing himself to break down. Then he spoke, almost reluctantly. "Your son walked into my world alone," he said. "People like me don't ignore bravery like that." Lena stared at him, unable to reconcile the rumor of the man with the man in front of her. Adrian Moretti, criminal king. Ruthless strategist. The kind of man mothers warned their children about. Yet here he was, standing in her doorway, protective, quiet, uncomfortably human. Days passed. Lena's bruises faded slowly. Her strength returned even more slowly. Through it all, Adrian kept his distance, but his presence never left. Groceries appeared in the kitchen each morning, fresh bread, soup, fruit, things Lena hadn't been able to afford in months. Blankets were replaced silently. A broken latch on the front door was fixed so perfectly it looked new. Evan's worn shoes vanished one night and reappeared polished and mended. Whenever Lena asked how, Evan would shrug. Adrian did it. He'd say, like it was the most normal thing in the world. One evening, Lena stood in the kitchen doorway and found Adrian in the hallway, giving instructions to one of his men. But when he saw her, his voice softened instantly. "You're feeling better," he said. It wasn't a question. It was an observation. She nodded, her hand instinctively brushing the faint bruise on her cheek. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to." His eyes held hers for a moment longer than she expected. Focus on healing. It was simple, but gentle. And Lena felt something shift inside her chest, something quiet. Something she wasn't ready to name. Evan, however, had no hesitation. He adored Adrian now. He followed him around the house, asking questions, telling stories, offering drawings he made on scraps of paper. Adrian never brushed him off. He listened. He answered. He kept every drawing, folding them neatly and shelving them somewhere Lena couldn't see. The slow burn connection grew, without either adult admitting it. But danger had a way of reminding people that peace was always temporary. One afternoon, Lena received a call from Evan's school. Panic flooded her veins before she even heard the words. Evan didn't come out for dismissal. "He was here earlier, we're checking the cameras now." Her heart constricted so violently she could barely stand. Before she could call anyone, her phone buzzed again, an unknown number. She answered with shaking hands. "He's safe," Adrian's voice said on the other end. "I have him." She didn't remember driving. She only remembered arriving and seeing Evan run into her arms, sobbing that someone tried to grab him from the sidewalk. Lena clutched him, collapsing to her knees with relief, so fierce it made her dizzy. When she lifted her head, Adrian was standing a few feet away, watching her with a look she couldn't decipher. Something dark, something protective, something personal. She stood, still trembling, Evan clinging to her hip. For a moment, Adrian looked almost unsure, like he didn't know if he had the right to step closer. So Lena made the choice for him. She reached out and touched his hand. It was a soft touch, barely there, but Adrian froze, as if she had pressed something fragile into his palm. Lena felt the tension inside him. The surprise. The way he held completely still, not wanting to break whatever moment had just formed between them. "Thank you," she whispered. 2 simple words, but they carried everything: fear, gratitude, trust, and the beginning of something neither of them had expected. The moment stretched between them, gentle and charged all at once. And without saying it out loud, they both knew the danger was far from over, but they were no longer facing it alone. The days after the attempted kidnapping passed in a quiet tension that hid beneath ordinary moments. Lena found herself listening for footsteps outside the door, jumping every time the phone rang, waking at night to check that Evan was still breathing beside her. Trauma had a way of settling into the bones, whispering that danger lingered even when the house was still. Yet every time she looked out the window, there was a car she recognized. Black, unmarked, always parked 3 lengths behind her building, always watching. At first, she told herself it was coincidence, then reassurance, then intrusion. She rehearsed anger for days, what she would say if she confronted him, how she would demand her privacy back, how she would insist she didn't need anyone shadowing her life from a distance. But when Adrian finally showed up, her anger dissolved before she even spoke. It happened on a quiet afternoon. She was folding laundry on the sofa when a soft knock sounded at the door. 3 gentle taps that didn't match the knuckles of a violent world. When she opened it, Adrian stood on the threshold. Not imposing, not cold, just present. The dim hallway lighting softened the sharpness of his features, but nothing could dim the intensity of his gaze. "May I come in?" he asked. She stepped aside, letting him enter, though her heartbeat quickened in a way she couldn't control. He moved with silent confidence, stopping in the living room, his eyes drifting briefly to Evan's crayons scattered across the coffee table. "Is he home?" Adrian asked. "At a friend's apartment?" "A school project." She paused. "He's safe." Adrian nodded once, an almost imperceptible release of tension in his shoulders. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, just heavy with unspoken truths. Lena sat on the edge of the couch, twisting her fingers together. "Adrian," she began. Unsure where to start, he answered before she could continue. "I've been protecting you," he said. Since the night in the warehouse, his voice was steady. Not apologetic, not defensive, simply honest. Lena looked at him, expecting guilt or stubborn pride, but there was neither, only quiet certainty. "How much have you watched?" she asked. Her voice, fragile, enough to know you're safe. He paused, enough to intervene before anything reaches your door. The confession should have scared her, should have angered her. No woman wanted a man, let alone a mafia boss, ghosting through her life like a silent guardian. But Lena wasn't angry. Instead, warmth seeped through her chest, slow, reluctant, impossible to ignore. "I don't know why you care about us," she whispered, her voice barely holding together. "I don't understand what this is." Adrian's eyes softened. "Just for a moment. I don't know either," he admitted. Then, quieter than before, "But I do." Her breath caught, It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't romance. It wasn't even sentiment. It was truth. And something inside her, a piece she thought had been shattered, permanently shifted. Just slightly. Toward him. The moment hung suspended between them. Delicate as glass. Before eventually breaking on its own weight. Lena rose from the couch, clearing her throat. Needing motion to steady herself. "There's something I meant to give you," she said. She walked into the small kitchen. Retrieved something from a drawer. Then returned to where he stood. A single button. Dark. Matte. Heavy in her palm. "I found this," she said. "Back at the warehouse. I think it came off your coat when you were getting to me." Her hand trembled as she placed it in his palm. Not because she was frightened, but because the moment felt too intimate. Too revealing. Too much like crossing a boundary she had only danced around before. Adrian looked down at the button for a long beat. Then he looked at her. "Keep it," he said softly. She blinked. Thrown off. "Why?" His thumb brushed her wrist gently as he pushed her hand closed around the button. "So you don't forget you're not alone anymore." The words landed like a quiet shatter inside her chest. It was too much. Too honest. Too unexpected. Adrian turned and left before she could speak, slipping out the door with the same quiet certainty he always carried. But as he stepped into his car outside, he pulled a matching button from his coat, another spare, and looped it onto a thin piece of black thread. He hung it from his rearview mirror, where it swayed gently in the dim light. A silent answer. A quiet promise. In the weeks that followed, life began to settle into a new rhythm. For the first time in months, Lena felt like she could breathe. Adrian didn't visit often, but she felt his presence everywhere in the safer streets she now walked. In the repaired locks. In the morning silence that no longer hummed with fear. One morning, a sealed envelope was slipped under her door. Inside was a simple note with an address and a name. Mrs. De La Corte, owner. Blue Horizon Laundry. A legitimate business. The address matched a new job opening she'd heard rumors about, though no applications were being accepted publicly. When she arrived, the owner greeted her kindly, as if expecting her. "You come highly recommended," the woman said. "From who?" She never said. But Lena knew. It wasn't charity. It wasn't a handout. It was protection, crafted to look like opportunity. And the dignity of that made her eyes sting. Evan began sleeping through the night again. His drawings brightened, shifting from black and grey shadows to splashes of colour. He talked about school, friends, and superheroes, real ones. Not the kind that wore suits of darkness. Lena's bruises faded. Strength returned to her limbs. Hope returned to her face. But there was one thing she never stopped thinking about Adrian Moretti. Stepping into the shadows every time she stepped into the light. One night. Weeks later, Lena finished her late shift at the restaurant, her second job. The one she kept because routine made her feel normal again. The air outside was crisp, carrying the scent of rain on concrete. She hugged her coat tighter and walked toward her car. Something made her pause. He was there. Adrian leaned against the lamppost beside the alley entrance, half in shadow, half in pale streetlight. His presence didn't startle her, not anymore. She felt it before she saw him. Like her heartbeat recognized his, before her eyes did. He didn't move when she stepped outside. Didn't call her name. Didn't take a step forward. He just watched her with quiet restraint. As if approaching too quickly might break something delicate. Lena took a breath, her pulse quickening. She walked toward him, stopping a few feet away. "You don't have to stand so far away," she said softly. The sentence trembled at the edges, not from fear, but from the kind of vulnerability she had denied herself for too long. For a moment, Adrian didn't react. His jaw tightened, His fingers flexed at his side. 1,000 reasons to keep his distance passed behind his eyes. And then he stepped forward. One careful step, then another, stopping close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the cool night air. Close enough to see the softness in his expression that he hid from everyone else. He didn't reach for her. She didn't reach for him. They simply stood together under the streetlight, two people who had survived fear, danger, and loss. Finally choosing to stand in the same light. No kiss. No dramatic confession. Just a quiet beginning. A beginning that felt more powerful than anything spoken aloud. Lena lifted her gaze to meet his fully. And in that silent exchange, something passed between them, something patient, something steady, something inevitable. And Adrian, the man who had lived most of his life in the shadows, let himself breathe beside her. For the first time. Not as a protector, but as something he had never allowed himself to be, someone she could choose. Fade out. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If Adrian and Lena's journey touched you, let me know in the comments. Tell me which moments stayed with you the most. Your likes, your shares, and your subscriptions help this channel bring more stories of courage, protection, and unexpected love to life. So if you enjoyed this one, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves a good slow burn romance. And let me know where you're watching from. I read every message you leave.